And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. Some news and notes here in segment two, kind of the big happenings of the past few days, beginning with John Herdman's decision to leave the Canadian men's national team and take the Toronto FC job. I'm kind of looking at this two different ways. The first thing is that John Herdman's willingness to take the Toronto job and to bypass an opportunity to manage the Canadians men's national team in a World Cup on home soil says an awful lot. This is not one of those opportunities that is, quote unquote, too good to pass up, where you're walking into a Premier League job or the Spanish men's national team or something, or even the U.S. men's national team from a talent perspective and a resource perspective. This isn't a Serie A job. It's quite possibly the worst team in Major League Soccer. Hypothetically, somebody with John Herdman's track record should not be able to be wooed by a team where Toronto are in the table. However, that is putting everything in a vacuum. And the more I thought about this, the more I was reflecting on and kind of thinking about it from the context of the second part of this story for me, which is you can kind of follow a trail here. A lot of John Herdman's frustration with Canada soccer had to do with a lack of ambition and a lack of resources. You saw what he said at the Gold Cup. Maybe I always think it was the Nations League. Sorry, one of the two. You saw what he said this summer. He clearly believed he had a team that could compete for a World Cup on home soil and wasn't getting the resources he needed to maximize that. To me, that's just facts. Everything that, exactly what happened behind the scenes and what those conversations were like, how angry he really was, I don't know. But he was clearly frustrated with the fact that he had these hurdles from a federation standpoint that he looks south to the U.S. and to Mexico, and they don't have. Things as simple as just getting games scheduled in international windows. And so you pair that with the fact that Toronto is not your typical bottom of the table MLS team. From a talent perspective, from a brand perspective, from a financial perspective, obviously. And so when you think about who John Herdman is and the ambition that he clearly has, and part of what he was able to do with Canada, definitely on the men's side, and even to a certain extent on the women's side, is to get those players, those programs to dream big. And it eventually got to a point, unfortunately, where both sides, I think, kind of agreed they weren't going to be able to work together to achieve those ultimate dreams. But he is thinking and talking big. Toronto is the kind of club that allows you to do that because of the money you have and the players you can attract. And so, based on what we know from the public persona of John Herdman, I can absolutely see how he looks at this and goes, I can fix the problems. All I need is a a leadership team, a club that is going to back me and give me what I want to take it to the next level. Toronto is one of the few clubs in MLS that can do that and will do that. I'm not sure that it factors too much into John Herdman's calculus where the club is at now, right? He is very much about what it can be, how far can we go. So in many ways, this is a perfect fit because this is not your typical MLS job he's taking. Now, the other interesting part of this is you're hearing some reports about some disagreements with Alphonso Davies. Clearly, there are issues in the locker room in Toronto with your stars, who John Herdman has to figure out how to work with these guys, or they got to find a way to get them off the team. Because their talent is not overcoming all of the issues that are there. Something has to change. So that is one of the big tasks John Herdman has here is can this kind of fresh start allow him to jump into and invest in these relationships and make this work in a way that it wasn't really working, it seemed like, by the end with Canada. Very, very interesting decision and kind of analysis of this, thinking about it from John Herdman's perspective. Because, like I said, in a vacuum, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you factor in where he was, that financial situation, where he's going, that financial situation, and who he is, the puzzle pieces start fitting together a little bit better. Also want to talk briefly about Romelu Lukaku joining Roma on loan. Very strange transfer window for Lukaku. The bridges burned to Inter. The fact that he is still a Chelsea player, despite that club having no interest in using him, and him having no interest in being there, it seems. Ultimately, it's another temporary solution, this time Roma. And one of the first things I was thinking about here is Roma need Lukaku to deliver now. Bad start to the season. Injuries at the striker position. This is, maybe it ends up being a permanent transfer. But the biggest impact Lukaku can make is immediate. This is not about trying to have a team ready to go compete for a Champions League title in April and May, or a Serie A title at the end of the season. If this is going to be worth it, he has to help propel them into the Champions League. And they're already behind the 8 ball. And they don't have Tammy Abraham, which adds a really interesting dynamic to this. That he is coming in and he is going to be relied upon immediately. Because Andrea Bellotti just isn't cutting it. And on the Lukaku side of this, the longer he struggles and does not look like the player he was in his first stint at Inter, the harder it becomes for Chelsea to sell him and for him to find a permanent home. I was very much of the opinion after that season at Inter that he just fit perfectly there. Serie A was where he needed to be. He really is that good of a player. Sometimes it just doesn't work, and it didn't work for him at Chelsea. And outside of Everton, it hasn't really worked for him in the Premier League. But now you look at stint 2, and you take that one season away when he was brilliant, and it hasn't worked anywhere for a while. And I know some of that was the Inter changed their their system and their philosophy. Well, more the philosophy than the system, but change some things tactically. He talked about that during their Champions League run, that they kind of got back to what they did best the season before by the end, had some more success. The fact that he's not there is just weird to me, because that seemed like the best home he could possibly find. But here we are. He's at Roma. This is a huge season for him, because if it doesn't work here, and it didn't work last season really at Inter, and it hasn't worked in the Premier League, you're just running out of options. If you're Chelsea, in terms of, there was all those rumors about Juventus. If you're Juventus next season thinking about buying him, and he has another bad season, what is incentivizing you to do that? And at the most, or maybe a little bit higher level, what is incentivizing you to do that at the price Chelsea is going to want? Because we're getting to a point where it's Chelsea have to make sacrifices so somebody will take him off their hands, rather than he still has enough value that somebody is going to be willing to pay something for him. But maybe he has a great season, and this is very different next summer. But Roma need him. They need him to deliver now. We'll see if it happens. And then last thing real quickly before I wrap up, Greg Berhalter has announced his first U.S. men's national team squad of his second stint as manager. Got games against Uzbekistan on September 9th, Oman on September 12th. Two interesting first-time call-ups. Ben Kremasky, Inter Miami, dual national, kind of Argentine bond with Lionel Messi, choosing to accept this call-up to the U.S., and Christopher Lund, who plays for Palermo, in Serie B. I believe came through the Danish youth system, and his mom, I believe, was born in the U.S., and that's how he's eligible for the U.S. It'll be interesting to see him. I want to talk about Kremasky for a second, just because he's getting so much attention with everybody watching Inter Miami and the performances he's putting in. This is a really good sign that he's on this squad. These are the perfect games that go take some risks. If you leave off somebody who's a regular to give Kremasky a shot, so be it. The stakes are incredibly low here. And especially when the other country that is battling for his services has, his teammate Messi, and is building a infrastructure in the U.S. to recruit dual nationals like Kremasky. You got to get him in immediately. And that is what the U.S. did. See where it goes from here. See what he looks like. But he's been very good. Clearly he's got a lot of potential. Very cool story. Excited to see what he can do. This team has a lot of the high-profile guys in it. But to me, just generally, in these kind of windows, where there's just nothing at stake, there should always also be a couple guys getting their first caps, a couple guys that you're trying to just keep in the fold, continue to build that relationship, deepen that relationship with them, and hope that you can bring them into the pool for the long term. The other guy who is back in this team I wanted to point out real quickly is Malik Tillman. Been a little bit of a nomadic journey from him at the club level, but you saw some really good things at Rangers, saw some really good things in his time with the U.S. men's national team so far. So I'm really glad he's back in this team. He's another one of those guys that he probably wasn't making that World Cup squad, but it was one of those, I would like to see some more of him. He's showing a lot of potential. I'm excited about what he could be for the future. Bring those guys in. Give him more caps, more experience, more opportunities. I'm all for that decision as well. And then Florin Balogun, also in this squad, immediately, well, almost simultaneously, about the same time this squad gets released, he gets his move to Monaco. So I do want to talk about this part of it for a second. That's a home run. Love this move. He tore that league up last season. He knows it. He's comfortable. That was the league to go to for me. And he needed to move now. Arsenal clearly, for whatever reason, just didn't have a use for him. Which is fine. But you cannot be the starting number 9 and not just be out of favor, but just not be in your club's plans. There is a difference between Pulisic being on Chelsea's bench and Balogun being buried on the Arsenal depth chart even while Gabriel Jesus is injured. Those are not the same thing. And so now he's going to get a chance, way more playing time, still a really high level. Why can't he go score 15, 20 goals again and put in a season like he had with Reims on loan last season? When I saw these Monaco links, I thought, yes, that's the place. And it has happened. So Florin Balogun on his way back to Ligue 1. 2 names that are notable that I want to discuss that got left off this roster. The first one being Gio Reyna. Greg Berhalter said in an interview with, I think it was Vanity Fair, he hasn't talked to him yet. There's nothing new here. It's going to be a thing once Reyna is called into a camp again. It's going to be a thing moving forward because of how awkward that situation is. But this is injury related as well. So there's no need to risk Gio Reyna in, again, meaningless friendlies. I would like these conversations between these two to start happening sooner rather than later. But to me, there's nothing to take away from this other than Gio Reyna needs to stay healthy. If he's not playing for his club because of injury, he shouldn't be on national team duty either. If it was a do or die World Cup qualifier, then depending on his prognosis, then maybe it's a different conversation. But there's just no need to rush this, to force anything. Just let him recover, let him stay focused on trying to get the most he can out of this season and staying on the field for Dortmund. The other name I want to point out here is Brandon Vazquez. This is a very European-centric roster. I believe it's 4 MLS players, which makes sense because Europe has a break and MLS doesn't. So I'm also not putting too much stock into this. And it's one thing to want Brandon Vazquez on the B squad for the Gold Cup. It's another thing to want Brandon Vazquez in what is effectively an A squad. Pulisic, McKinney, Musa, Dest, Turner, Balogun. The big time players outside of Tyler Adams, who's still recovering from his injury, are there. And so it's not shocking Brandon Vazquez didn't make this team. The point I want to make, though, is the more times this happens under Greg Berhalter, the more perplexed and frustrated I will be. Especially if Vazquez gets a move to Europe this winter and performs well. Because Greg Berhalter was not the one in charge of that roster for the Gold Cup. He seems to not buy into what Brandon Vazquez does and who Brandon Vazquez is. Which is his prerogative if that position delivers. But to keep throwing and Balogun changes this equation because he's got the most impressive resume. He certainly is going to get that opportunity, and rightfully so. But bringing in the same other guys who aren't really producing the way you want and leaving Vazquez out in the cold, I will never go to bat for that strategy. Doesn't mean he's actually one of the 3 best strikers in this pool. I'm not convinced of that. Especially now with Balogun there. But I would like to think he is one of the guys that can continue to put pressure on the Ricardo Pepes, the Jesus Ferreras of the world. That if you don't deliver and you're not in good form, I'm going to be there and you can trust me to score goals. Even if he's not exactly the kind of player Greg Berhalter wants. So that was interesting to me as well. When you see a guy like Cade Cowell, obviously different position, but you see Cade Cowell on this team and you don't see Brandon Vasquez. There just have not been very many opportunities that Brandon Vasquez has gotten under Berhalter. And I'm going to continue to monitor this because it's a very interesting situation for me. And the way Vasquez is going, it's going to become harder and harder to ignore this if he continues on the trajectory he's headed toward. And he gets his move to a top 5 European league. He starts scoring goals. And he's doing it at a higher level than anybody but Balogun. And maybe he's even doing it in a better league than Balogun. Doesn't mean he should automatically be the starting number 9. But I expect Brandon Vasquez to just keep putting his name into this conversation. And just being one of those guys who won't go away and almost forces Berhalter to put him on rosters. He's got to keep delivering and keep performing to do that. But it did stand out to me that he was not part of this team. Again, I am sure MLS had a lot to do with that, and FC Cincinnati trying to win the Supporters' Shield and all of that. So I'm not reading too much into it for this camp in particular, but I did want to point it out and talk about it for a few minutes.